Hello and welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I'm really looking forward to spotlighting one of Al Capone's golden boys, Frank Rio. Rio had a habit of being able to stay in the peripheral of major mafia events or in the background altogether, but today I'm going to do my best to bring him center stage for you. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to that Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Frank Rio, known as one of, if not the most loyal of Al Capone's bodyguards, appears tangentially in nearly all of the famous Capone moments in history. And while his boss is known to even the most casual of mafia enthusiasts, Rio himself is shrouded in mystery. Which, if you've been familiar with this channel for long, means that you know he's been one of my favorites to cover. Franklin Rio was born on June 30th, 1895. Other sources list his birthday as January 15th, 1895, and others still list his birthday as July 2nd, 1895. It seems to be the consensus that he was born in 1895, as that is what's listed on his tombstone. However, the exact date is not, and since June 30th seems to be the consensus across most sources, that's the story we're sticking with here at Racket Reviews. Rio was either the eldest or second eldest of Anthony and Rosa Costa Rio's 4 children. Frank Rio had a brother Lawrence, a World War I veteran who died in 1918. Upon first glance, it seemed to me that Lawrence was Frank Rio's older brother, since it seems he died or at least served in World War I. Private Lawrence Rio was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and while his birth year is not listed, his grave indicates that he died on October 14th, 1918, which could have put him in active duty during the First Great War. This doesn't necessarily mean that Lawrence was Rio's older brother, since Frank Rio himself would have been eligible to serve in World War I by the time the US got involved in 1917. A good case for Frank being the eldest brother is the fact that Frank's paternal grandparents were Frank and Angelina Rio, and it seems strange to me that Frank's father, Anthony, would name his second son after his father rather than his first. Frank Rio also had 2 younger sisters, Angeline and Susan Rio, respectively, which seems to further bolster the case that Frank Rio is the eldest brother named after his paternal grandfather, since the eldest sister of the family was named after their paternal grandmother. Am I putting too much into this? Of course not. That's why you subscribe to this channel, right? Because you know that I'm going to dig deep into the questions about which nobody asked. Rio's parents, Anthony and Rosa, were first-generation immigrants from Oliveto Sitra, a province of Salerno in the Campania region of Italy. At least Anthony was. Rosa's birthplace was merely listed as Italy. Frank Rio also seems to have been born in Italy according to his birth certificate and death certificate, which this could still be untrue. The record keeping of that time, especially for mobsters, is just not clear, but to me it seems probable that he was born in Italy, especially if he was the eldest son, which I believe he was. Anthony Rio was listed as a laborer under his occupation in the census, while his wife was listed as a housemaker. Rosa would live to see at least Frank into adulthood, possibly Lawrence, depending on how old he really was, before her death on July 25th, 1913, at the age of 48 or 49. Frank Rio's young adult life was marked by loss. Starting with his mother in 1913, Rio would have been around 18 at that time, followed by the death of his brother Lawrence in October of 1918 when Rio was 23, and then tragically the death of his youngest sister Susan in 1919 when he was 24. She was only 14 at the time of her death. If you're keeping track, that means within a span of 6 years, this family of 6 was reduced to a family of 3. His father Anthony, Frank himself, and his sister Angeline. Angeline would go on to marry a gas station attendant by the name of Sebastiano de Filippis, and the couple would have a daughter together by the name of Rosetta. Rosetta would live until 2008, having married a man named Mort Cole. It's unclear whether or not Rosetta had children. Until my leads ran cold, it would seem that Rosetta was Rio's last living blood relative. Rio himself was married sometime in the 19-teens to a woman named Anna Blanche Chappelle Rio. I found out later by way of an Al Capone letter that she went by Blanche. More on Capone's letter later. The couple did not have children of their own, but rather adopted 2 children. Other sources do seem to indicate that there was only the adoption of 1 child, but to me, Capone's letter being a primary source and listing 2 children and him knowing Rio so well, which we'll get to, seems to me the more reliable source in this case. So, 2 adopted children. Named Lawrence, named after Frank's brother and born in 1921, and Lorraine, born in 1932. I am not sure at what age they were adopted. Rio's time as a criminal began early, with his first newspaper piece being in 1918. Interestingly, the first bit of newspaper fame came from a gossip section in a Chicago newspaper, discussing how he was a penny pincher and would barely come off of $1 a week for his wife to spend, and this led to her filing for separation. This happened in 1918 and was featured among a list of several men who were mean to their wives, many of whom had even threatened to kill their wives, but Rio seemed to be just a miser. The separation did not lead to divorce, obviously, and Rio at this time would begin gaining a reputation as a thief. It was in 1918 that Rio first hit the newspapers as a thief as well. Specifically, he was known to perform robbery through holdups, although he was arrested for burglary as well. By the way, as a quick aside, the difference between robbery and burglary is that robbery refers to stealing or attempting to steal possessions, money, etc. by force, whereas burglary typically comes alongside breaking and entering or otherwise stealing without anyone's knowledge, which is why you always see the Hamburglar sneakily stealing all the hamburgers in McDonaldland, although later he would be considered a friend of Ronald McDonald. The Hamburglar has a complex history within the McDonald-verse, but the point is, he didn't take burgers by force, which is why he was called the Hamburglar rather than the Ham Robber. Anyway, back to our thief of the video. Frank Rio and his partner Carmen Talia were arrested but not convicted in September of 1918 for robbing a bank in Maywood, Illinois. They were suspected of holding up the Maywood State Bank and taking $45,000 in cash and Liberty bonds. Witness reports explained that the two young men were cussing like sailors, and later they were not convicted, likely due to their young age. And it would seem Rio would learn nothing from this early run-in with the law. By November 10, 1919, Rio had racked up 8 indictments, plus he was arrested for loading stolen furs from Joseph W. Klein's fur shop, literally caught red-handed by a police officer while out on $43,500 in bonds from his previous indictments. He was also an infamous car thief, perhaps the best in the city at the time. Miraculously, he was able to avoid trial yet again. It's hard to say exactly when his underworld nickname of Slippery Frank Rio, in reference to his ability to evade consequences, took root, but most sources agree that this title was granted to him very early on. Fast forward to 1921, and Frank Rio, along with Robert O'Neill and Thomas Dyer, were arrested and indicted in connection with the Union State mail robbery of $482,000 in bonds on January 17, 1921. Once more, to the shock of many, these charges were ultimately dropped. It was found later that these criminals were colluding with judges, but it doesn't change the fact that Slippery Rio, once again, escaped justice. It was around this time that Capone's outfit noticed Rio, although the specifics of how these men met is unclear. What we do know is that in short order, Rio was considered one of the most loyal bodyguards of Al Capone. There's probably a debate to be had, maybe in the comment section below, over who was the more loyal of Capone's bodyguards, McGurn or Rio, but either way, Rio's loyalty was the stuff of legends nonetheless. It's reported throughout the underworld that Capone referred to Rio and McGurn both as his golden boys. Capone really seemed to like the cut of Rio's jib, and was soon bouncing ideas off of him, and Rio was more than Capone's bodyguard, he was his personal assistant and friend. By September 20th, 1926, when the war between Capone and Jaime Weiss was really heating up, Capone was attacked at his headquarters in Cicero at the Hawthorne Inn. Weiss's men drove by and filled the hotel with bullets from machine guns. Capone was uninjured thanks to the alleged quick thinking and response time of Frank Rio, who threw Capone to the ground and protected him from the attack. In fact, both men were unharmed. Make sure to check out previous episodes of Racket Reviews to get more context on the North Side-South Side War and Capone himself. Although it is the general consensus that Frank Rio is the bodyguard who protected Capone from this attack, I should note that this isn't technically known for a fact, so we need to use the phrase allegedly when telling the story. Frank Rio, although once again, with the information we have available, it is impossible to ever know for sure, is also suspected of having been one of the gunmen in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, ordered by Al Capone against his North Side rival George Bugs Moran's men, who had taken over for the Northsiders after Wise's death. Frank Rio's other claim to fame with Capone comes when the likes of Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Giunta attempted to betray Capone. The 3 men whom Capone, very much according to legend, beat to death with a baseball bat after tricking them into coming to dinner with him. Joseph Giunta and John Scalise, the new president and vice president respectively of the Unione Siciliana, the organization upon which Capone heavily relied in order to keep his outfit running, in addition to Scalise's partner Albert Anselmi, were planning to betray Capone's outfit by working with rival gangster Joe Aiello. It's reported that Rio found out about this. How exactly he came across this information is once again unclear. When Rio told this information to Capone, Capone couldn't believe it and wanted this confirmed. Capone and Rio concocted a scheme to check the legitimacy of this claim. The plan was that over dinner with Scalise and Anselmi, Capone and Rio would feign an argument, which resulted in Rio slapping Capone across the face and storming off. Quite the theatrical performance. Scalise and Anselmi fell for this plan hook, line, and sinker, it would seem, as the story goes that the two men would track Rio down and offer to include him in their coup with Giunta and Aiello. Rio falsely agreed, providing this evidence to Capone. These three men, Scalise, Anselmi, and Giunta, were the men Capone allegedly beat to death with a baseball bat after setting up a fake dinner to throw in their honor. Although this story about the baseball bat is very much considered urban legend and not legitimate, it should be noted that the coroner said that the three men were beaten beyond recognition, and, of course, it makes for the iconic moment in the 1987 Paramount Pictures film, The Untouchables, starring Robert De Niro as Al Capone. Always a pleasure to see De Niro in a mob movie. Now, although the part about Capone beating the men to death with a baseball bat is very much considered urban legend, I do believe that Capone finding out that the men had betrayed him through the likes of Rio seems very likely. Some reports claim that in lieu of the popular baseball bat story, that Rio himself was the man who beat the would-be rebels to death and left their bodies to be discovered in Hammond, Indiana. We'll never know for sure, but I do think it's worth a speculation that Rio, having been the double agent, was also the man who carried out the murder of these conspirators. This would send a message to them before they breathed their last that not only had their plans to betray Capone failed, but that Rio had been the one to trick them. Rio would also attend the Atlantic City Conference with Al Capone from May 13th to May 16th of 1929. This conference is considered to be the first of its kind in the US, wherein heads of several criminal organizations across the country got together to make major decisions regarding the future of organized crime. Topics of discussion included, but were not limited to, the cessation of competition between each other for the remainder of Prohibition, and the agreement to cooperate and pool their resources to make transportation of liquor easier across state lines. They also decided what to do when Prohibition ended. The writing was certainly on the wall that this law was coming to an end, and it was decided here to work together to make interconnected groups of legitimate breweries, distilleries, and of course, importation franchises, which would go on to import all sorts of other illicit substances and products. They would also own several nightclubs and bars that would feed into this machine, supplying to one another. Some reports do claim that instead of this big meeting of the minds of the mafia families, that this was a disciplinary meeting against Capone himself to stop his murderous syndicate from giving them a bad name and bringing them press to them, but that seems less likely, as most reports would indicate that this was just a big party. Sort of like an organized crime convention rather than a buttoned-up meeting. Many other decisions were made as well, and I might cover this conference specifically in a future episode of the show if I feel that there's really enough to talk about there. Let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in that, but for today, I want to stay focused on Rio. It's no secret that after the conference, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia for an illegal weapons possessions charge. Frank Rio was arrested right alongside him. Some reports even claim that Capone's arrest was intentional and planned, so as to avoid being murdered. I don't know that I'm quite convinced of this, but it does make sense that Rio would be arrested alongside of him if Capone was afraid of being murdered. I'm not convinced of this, but I do think it's worth consideration. The two men were arrested on May 16, 1929, after being stopped by police detectives outside of the Stanley Theater in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were both carrying handguns, and according to Capone and Rio's statements, they claimed that they were merely waiting in Philadelphia for the next train to Chicago. They claimed to have missed their scheduled train ride to Chicago because they'd been having car trouble, and since they now had a few hours to kill, they went to the theater for entertainment. Capone and Rio would end up staying a year in jail for this possessions charge, and while many reports indicate that Capone orchestrated all of this himself, if that's true, he certainly put on a good show of being a reluctant prisoner. His attorney attempted to postpone this trial and set up an agreement that in exchange for Capone's discharge on a bond, that he would never return to Philadelphia and to arrange a suspended sentence. Capone would also lament the speediness of the trial and the lengthy punishment that came along with it. He was constantly seeking an appeal. The idea that all of this was orchestrated by Al Capone to me seems more of something that the media concocted in order to drive ratings, but Capone certainly did not seem like this was something he was hoping for. It is, however, from the stent behind bars that we get the images of his lavish cell and the evident special treatment that was afforded to him in lockup. Rio would serve his sentence alongside Capone. After this brief time behind bars, law enforcement was hot on the trail of Capone, and when they brought the tax evasion charges to bear, it was Rio, allegedly, who had warned Capone that this was no joke and could have extremely bad ramifications. Rio himself was having legal troubles after his return to Chicago. On November 13, 1930, Rio was sent before a judge for vagrancy. After the bailiff ordered Rio and others to line up so that they could get a better look at them, Rio responded by telling the bailiff to go to hell, and the bailiff responded by slapping Rio across the face, which caused Rio to bring out some of that blue language that had made him famous in one of his very first arrests. 6 months were added to Rio's sentence for bad behavior. Back to Capone's upcoming tax evasion charges, Big Al was not particularly worried about being convicted and spent his time in Florida having suits tailored. It's reported that Rio told Capone that he ought to have the tailor put stripes on his suit because he was going to be behind bars soon. And Rio was of course right about this. When Capone was convicted for tax evasion in 1931, that marked the end of his time as the outfit boss. And it's reported that Rio was considered for taking on the headship role following Capone's departure. It's unclear exactly why he was passed over. Some report that he had gone soft after his time tagging along with Capone and his comparatively posh activities. Others claim that he simply never developed any leadership skills. Others still say that his deteriorating health made him a poor choice. Whatever the reason, Frank Needy, or Paul Ricca, if you're somebody who believes that Needy was just the front man, you can check out my previous video on that topic, was chosen to take on the role of the new outfit boss. Rio would spend his time and resources getting into cleaners' protection rackets and selling beer. Rio didn't seem to have any hard feelings about his decision and would continue to cooperate during Needy's tenure. He was actually the mobster sent to New Jersey to offer the help of the Chicago outfit to find celebrity pilot Charles Lindbergh's missing son in March of 1932, an offer which was promptly declined. It seems that Rio had no issue with the reshuffling of leadership. Perhaps that was because he was too busy being worried about his own mortality to feel slighted by being passed over as boss. It was in this year that Rio started suffering from physical weakness and difficulty breathing due to his heart condition. Frank Rio would succumb to heart disease and die from a coronary occlusion, which caused a heart attack on February 23, 1935. He was only 39 years old. Strangely, his underworld associates would leap into action to take his body to their preferred undertaking service, Rago Undertaking, which is still in operation today by Louis H. Rago, named after his grandfather and founder of the business, Louis Rago. It was this service that also provided undertaking for Capone himself. What made this peculiar to law enforcement was the fact that Rio died of natural causes. Because of that, there was no reason for the mafia to jump in and take his body to their preferred undertaker, presumably to clean up and soften the edges around the circumstances surrounding his death. Rio died of natural causes, so what was the point of all of that? It was believed that since Rio had such an influence in the nightclub and gambling scene, that they wanted to divvy up his influence away from prying eyes. Capone, from his jail cell, was devastated by the news of Rio's death. He wrote a lengthy letter to his wife mourning Rio's death and seemed to indicate that he was not convinced that this death was due to natural causes. An excerpt from the letter reads as follows. Ask Ralph, Capone's brother, how sure he is that it was heart trouble, as, honey, you know Frank was at all times real healthy and strong, and really, I can't understand it, and for Ralph to find out, and you let me know. Capone was, of course, out of the loop and quickly losing his mental faculties, and so his letter to his wife doesn't necessarily provide evidence of foul play, but this, including the mafia's strange reaction to what was presumably a natural death, does make for an odd situation. Frank Rio, despite his Catholic faith, was denied a Catholic funeral. A priest was called to the undertakers to pray over his body instead. Rio had a large funeral with several hundred vehicles in the procession and was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Rio's wife, Anna, would remarry on November 29, 1935, and would tragically die in a car accident on December 26 of 1935. At this point, her many jewels and monies provided for her through her late husband would be taken back by way of intimidation by his former associates, much to the chagrin of she and Rio's children and her new husband and his family, I'm sure. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the short and thrilling life of Frank Rio, about whom little is known. Early tragedy likely led to Frank Rio's crabby disposition, but that didn't stop him from hooking his star to the larger-than-life Al Capone and joining the big leagues of organized crime, and then dying under peculiar, if not mysterious, circumstances. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Frank Rio. Also, don't forget to utilize the comment section and social media to let me know about who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.